Joshua 13 is the read for this week, if you want to make your way over there in your Bible. And I don't know that it's going to be a significant change over 12.
There's some listing again.
I think
there's
we're going
listing.
I think we're going to be doing listing for a while, right?
Yes.
Because we're going sort of from conquest to settling and getting everybody their portion of the land.
It's like going downtown and reading the plats on Harris County and just how all the properties are divvied up. If you like a verbal version of a map,
kind of what's going on here.
But still worth reading for some reasons we should talk about.
So let's talk about a little bit about where 13 sits in the book and some ways that it sort of sets up.
Yeah, yeah. So I think at the 30,000 foot level, a couple things to notice about chapter 13. First of all, as it begins, literally Joshua was old and advanced in years, and the Lord said to him, "You were old and advanced in years, and there remains yet very much land to possess. This is land that yet remains," and it goes on to give him a little bit of a list right there. So again, understand, and this is how the end of the book's also going to work. We get to chapters, about 23, 24. Joshua's old and advanced in years, and so we're actually, ironically, we're textually in the middle of the book. We're hitting chronologically the wrap-up time for Joshua's life. The stories of the battles, what we're used to, is first half of the book. And so first of all, just to understand where we're at in the timeline, we're kind of on the backside of Joshua's life, where God is beginning to ironically transition out of Joshua's era and have Joshua start preparing the people for what comes after him. The other thing is then this chapter serves as almost an introduction, a prologue to, again, 14 to maybe about 21 off the top of my head, where we do have allotments, tribe by tribe, allotments given, a verbal version of a map, if you will, describing cities, and regions that each tribe is going to have allotted to them by God. They're not going to pick their portions. God's giving out the portions through Joshua. But there's a little bit of setup here conceptually, and that's what chapter 13 is about. Before we talk about the land that's been being conquered in the book, there's some things to talk about in chapter 13 to set up the beginnings of the inheritances given out in chapter 14.
Yeah, and one of the things that caught my attention is right at the beginning, in verse 1, very much of the land remains to be possessed.
Yeah.
And that seems to me that's going to be an idea that's going to really run all the way through Judges. I think you could make
that's right. No,
argument
this is setting up the plot of Judges. That's exactly right.
Yeah. So we were talking about this last week. The area is now under Israel's control.
Yes.
But not all the pockets of resistance,
right.
Maybe the pockets of presence of the Canaanites in the land are still there, and it's the task of each of these tribes as they get in their areas to finish up the sort of the mop-up operations, right?
Yes.
And to completely drive the enemy out of the land. And it seems to me that all the way through this, that's going to end up being a theme, first from this is the reality, which is where we are in 13:1, to the failure to take care of that, and then getting into Judges, the consequences because they didn't take care of it.
That's right. And so, just again, conceptually, people are struggling with this. Is this a contradiction? This seems weird. No, conceptually, what chapter 12 told us last week is, in the days of Joshua, they went around and took out the major cities and the major kings that could truly be a problem to their hegemony over the region. But now that the major players, the major kings and cities have been subdued, now we're going to lot the land out, and it's up to each tribe to deal with the local militias, we might say today, right? Because again, even if like in our own country, even though your Civil War history, we, when you're taught it in school, the major battles. We don't talk about the local regional militias and the little skirmishes here and there in various states and various parts of, particularly in the South, and those smaller scale struggles. We focus on the big Antietam and Shiloh and Gettysburg. Whereas if you're a real Civil War buff, or you're academically a Civil War historian teaching deep courses on this, there's all these little local actions that we never talk about in the big story. We're at the point where now it's time, there's going to be local actions, and that's where the book of Judges is going to kick in, local actions, and the whole issue is if you don't finish taking out the local action, eventually these people are going to be thorns in your side, scourges.
Right. Then
you're going to wind up intermarrying. Then you're going to wind up worshiping their gods, and then you're going to wind up being the Canaanites yourselves, and God's going to have to deal with you. is kind of what's going on here.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's that way with every war. It was that way in World War II, especially in the Pacific, where they just actually passed over whole islands of Japanese defenders because
irrelevant to the larger
they weren't
task.
relevant to the larger taking back control of the Western Pacific. And so same kind of thing here. But it isn't just their evil influence. Israel's conquest was in part judgment of God on the nations because of their evil.
That's right.
And so these guys are getting a pass on their evil and are persisting in them.
Yeah, that's right. Well, and again, that's why, again, not so much here in our text right now, but other places in the Old Testament, God makes clear to them, if you tolerate these people among you, if you adopt their ways through intermarriage and idolatry, you adopt their ways, then in my eyes you will become them. I'm paraphrasing loosely, and I will deal with you, which is why exile will come for you the way I have removed them from the land. I will exile you from the land if you become what they are. You do not have a perpetual right as such to the land. I will find other ways to keep my promise to Abraham. Which we now, of course, New Testament know exactly what God had in mind.
Yeah. So the other thing that's unfolds here in 13, you described this as the opening act.
Yeah.
We do begin to have a discussion of the settlement, and there seems to be like particular attention given to the eastern side of the Jordan.
Yeah.
And Moses re-enters the picture.
Yes.
Because there were some decisions actually made about parceling out the land even prior to conquest.
No, that's exactly right. Starting about verse 9, and what really takes up the bulk of the chapter from there, is a flashback or reminders of what happened in Moses' day before he was gone. Because Joshua, his own lifetime, his own work given to him by God was on the western side of the Jordan. That's why the book begins with spy out Jericho, part the Jordan, go across, and that's where Joshua's story unfolds. Before Moses was gone, this is Book of Numbers stuff. Later parts of Book of Numbers. Before Moses was gone, when they were taking out the Amorites, the Midianites, the Moabites, Sihon and Og were the great kings there. 2.5 tribes had said, we kind of like it over here. We got a lot of cattle. This land really fits what we need. And for a brief period, there was even Moses was greatly concerned. Oh, we're doing another Kadesh and Barnea. We don't have faith to go into the land. No. They make clear this is great grazing land. We'd like to have this land. God is okay with that as long as their men go across and help with the subduing of the actual. So this chapter, part of the prologue before we get to the dividing of the land that's not been taken, was this land was taken in Moses' day, subdued, so much so they had left their littles, their women, their children behind.
They're really just going back home after the battle.
They're going back home. And so this is, again, part of the prologue is a reminder of the scope of what these 2.5 tribes had already received in the days of Moses. As a recap and as a prologue from the book of Numbers, before chapter 14, we now begin to take care of the rest of the tribes and the land that in Joshua's day has been subdued. This was land that was subdued in the days of Moses.
So because we're going to be dealing with this for a while in Joshua, can we at least say a word or two to encourage people not to give up on the list? Because I think there's a temptation when we start reading through here. I know we're going to go ahead in chapter 15. There's going to be a big old huge long list, and I think as people encounter that, the reading gets discouraging. So you commented earlier about that. Let's just unpack that idea a little bit. Why do we need to hang with this? And read through these chapters that seem to be just sort of technical list without a lot of practical relevance.
Yeah. And so what's funny is, and I think this maybe hits us a little bit about actually how we read the Bible sometimes. And since this is about reading the Bible, this is our congregational reading. There are times when, yes, these lists don't have immediately, help you with your lying issue or your, or your struggles with lust and pornography, the typical moralistic issues that we look for. I need relevance. I need application. There are other reasons we read the Bible. It's not just for immediately what's dealing with the sin in my life. Sometimes it's about a bigger picture of who God is, what he's done, and how he works. And so literally here, the whole point is the detail for us today. In other words, sometimes we get tired with, we feel like, sometimes sermons or Bible classes, we don't have direct relevance or immediate application. The detail is the point for us. The detail is, I get tired of hearing sermons about just, let go and let God, because that doesn't seem how that's working in my life. Well, this is a reminder that God, even when you don't always see it, the details do matter to God. every one of these places, regions, cities, valleys, what have you, God was with them to help them take it. We're just used to reading the stories in 10 minutes, making a couple of applications out of about how God will be with us today, and we forget this is what God looked like. Will it look like when God was with them in the details? And so literally as a reminder that even when we don't see it, God is intimately involved. And also the other thing is, and the work of God, it's easy to read these stories and say, man, that's wonderful. Jericho fell, they took Hatzor, whatever.
No great songs about chapter 14, by the way.
Right, that's right. That's right.
Or 13,
But the point is, when you look at the details, this actually took a long period for them, and there was a lot of details of them obeying God in these small little bits, bit by bit, village by village, city by city, to subdue, to go over. And so, God has been faithful to them all the way down into the details, all the way down into the small bits. God has been with them, even as they have to do their part. And it was not have been easy or fun to go bit by bit and drive out, occupy, claim, possess. And yet that was, they had to do it, and God was with them in it. This is where we were reminded that even for eras when God is active and maybe even sometimes visible miraculously, they still had to go through in the bit-by-bit mundane parts of daily life and do their part and do their duty. And that's a reminder for us too. Even back in those days when God is so miraculously present, there were still mundane, boring days. Read the list and realize that's still part of what it means to follow God.
Yeah, and tucked within all of that are also these thematic threads, like, what are you supposed to do when you settle in your peace? You're supposed to drive out the remaining people.
Yeah.
There's still enemy in the land. All of those references, I think, are setting up how the rest of the story plays out.
Yeah.
And so this period and this work, this stuff that's being described, continues to contain these threads of the broader story going on, that you're supposed to go in, you're supposed to take the land, you're supposed to drive out these people. If you don't, it's going to be a big problem for you, which is what the story primarily ends up being about as we finish up Joshua and get into Judges. And so I think sometimes tucked within what seems like a list, like a genealogy, Matthew's genealogy is very interesting. The names that are mentioned there.
Yeah.
If you took the time to actually read the list and think about who these people are, suddenly you're thinking, wait, that's kind of important. And so sometimes tucked within the details of what seems like unimportant stuff winds up being real important as you start piecing together the broader story. And so I think we need to work to think on that level as we read these parts of the Bible that aren't quite as exciting as the walls of Jericho going down, or an 85-year-old guy taking out giants, right? Still need our careful consideration. Holy Spirit saved that for us. So ponder that as we jump off into chapter 13 and start thinking about how God's going to parcel up this land.